It's
Byron
way
did.
easier
You're just
to chase than to
right.
be chased.
You just can't screw it up. Like, let's stay within what we got going here. And,
Yep.
if you're chesting.
Yeah, and that's what I talked about with you on why I thought it was easier for me to chase than to be chased is that, when I get out front, unless it's like a short track, intermediates, we are on the ragged edge. I know you can't see it on TV, and sometimes they show where we're kind of getting bobbled or out of shape, but I mean, we're one tire slip away from spinning out, one way or another. And so when I get to the lead, I crank it down to 90%, right? And then what happens then is the person behind is like, okay, well, I'm going to 100. I'm chasing now. And so it just always is going back and forth in that kind of way. And so that's why you saw the race staying as tight as it was. And for Byron, he's trying to get around these lap cars, and that's something that he hadn't. It's almost like Darlington. Do you remember Darlington? He dominated the race, but there was no lap traffic. And until he got to lap traffic, that's where it was like, okay, he's vulnerable. He couldn't move around as good as he needed to. Like I when
That's that when you go uphill and it's a third gear, but I'm a little bit wider so I can make a bigger turn in so I can get pound downhill.
I had one guy riding my bumper and he braked so late behind me that he made himself crash because I braked at 175. He wasn't ready for it.
When I watched him, he had two lanes that he could go. And so luckily and fortunate for me, the one lane he was leaving open is where I was best. So that made for really, really good racing because he was never really in my way or in my lane, and I never really was in his. So we both got to utilize our strength.
Yeah, I noticed that I watched the HBO, your in-car HBO Max Cam, for two significant stints of this race. The first one being earlier in the day when you were running seventh or eighth, trying to pass Allmendinger, and he could run all over the racetrack.
I was so frustrated. Yeah.
Yeah, but then so I've noticed that, right? He can run all over the track.
He was running all over the track because he was staring in his mirror. Yeah,
but his car could do that, right? Whereas when he
was slowing down to do it.
Okay,
yeah.
But when you get to Byron, it seemed like William was very consistent in the line that he was running, and you could do what you wanted to do.
Yeah, I felt pretty versatile. I felt as though I was best in the middle of the racetrack. He was best all the way at the top. But I could run the top when I needed to. Like I could do it. It's not like I relied on it. And so it seemed like Chastain was really good on the top. He was able to make the bottom work a few times in 3 and 4 as well. But yeah, it was strength on strength.
When you're trying to set up, like you're trying to chase down Byron, are you running a line that maybe isn't your strength to get him to block that, so then like set him up to make that move with the line that you know is going to work for you?
Yeah. So every time I would catch him, he would move down to my lane. He was willing to sacrifice overall lap time to just block, and that's typically kind of how it normally goes in the Cup Series now. Is that everyone just plays defense versus running minimum lap time, and so you got to have a car that's versatile. You can't have one that it makes speed as long as I've got this one line. Like, I really focus on making sure I can run the same lap time in multiple lanes. It's like option A, option B, option C. Like, I know when I see them dart one way or the other, I've got like 0.3 of a second to then make up my mind, where am I going? And I know in my head I've got 3 options. I know what the 3 fastest lanes are for my car on any given day, and based off of where they go, then I'll choose what option I'm going to take.
I thought Amazon did a good job of, they were showing Byron's eyes. Like, they were like, watch right now, he's going to look down because he's looking at his mirror. And like, I thought it was interesting to see you guys trying to, go after each other.
Yeah, they showed your eyes too. I mean, you'd win. Certainly no one's beating you in a staring contest when you're in a race car.
No, I felt it last night. I had to put like 20 drops in each eye. Like, my eyes were so freaking dry. And when I look at the clips on social media of me I've done this my whole career. I remember Bristol, they had an in-car and I had a clear visor. And I think I went, I think it was like 6 or 7 straight laps with not one blink. No blink. And it's just, I don't know, that's just always the way it's not intentional. Right. I do a lot of weird up things, but I don't, it's just habit.
I've always wondered why drivers wear glasses, because I hate when I wear contacts, but it makes sense. Like, if you wear contacts, those things are going to get so dry, and like you can't afford that.
I mean, mine were like welded shut. Or welded open. Just yikes. I mean, even today I feel it. So I know that I can feel when I am staring and not blinking after races. Like, there's some races that I do it, everything feels fine afterwards. But there's some races where the intensity's up. I just don't blink.
Can you like not afford to blink? Or
I don't know what it is. I think it's just focus.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's just focus.
Yeah, it looked like your head was also
that was
bouncing around.
They showed that quite a bit, and we tried to fix it overnight because I had it real bad in practice, and it's just a weird situation where the track is so bumpy at Charlotte in turns 3 and 4 that I try. We have a minimum left side headrest, minimum right side, and so I have this small gap that's in between. Well, as I'm going over these bumps, I noticed in practice, like, my head was just ping-ponging off of both sides. And it's almost like if you dropped a ping pong ball on this table, how it gets the rebound and then it just keeps going and keeps going. That's what I felt like. It just wouldn't stop. Even after I was done with the bumps, the thing is still rattling back and forth. So we tried to open the gap a little bit for Sunday, and it might have made it a little bit better. But it's something we got to look into because, I told him I'm going to be concussed after this race. I am just getting my head knocked side to side every lap.
Were other drivers having this issue?
I don't know. I would think so. Everyone's,
like,
Listen, paying $14.99 a month for a streaming app and $9.99 a month for a music app and $12.99 for a fitness app and more money for a bunch of other apps, that really adds up.
So why not get YouTube Premium for just $13.99? It's like by weighing before and after. But then how much fuel didn't actually get in the car? How much went on the ground? You know, like there's so many variables to know if you actually have enough. And maybe it's just listening to your radio so much, but it seems like it's happened a handful of times in the last handful of years. Where it's like there's always some sort of fuel
come out, not enough fuel. That's why I'm just utterly frustrated that in the last 3 or 4 years, I mean, I had to pit on the white flag lap of Pocono while leading.
right.
Me, man.
So we sing. I know you won't say a whole lot here because you don't want to clear my. But we sing like pit crews are a big thing nowadays. Or everyone's talking about them. They're these former athletes, and you know how important they are. Do you talk to them afterwards, or what's the dynamic like? Because you know,
No, when you win, you pick teams. That's the team's place. I'm the driver. It's not my.
you're the
I
quarterback.
don't know, but it's not my job to yell at the offensive line. Like, I get it that the quarterback does sometimes, but they're trying. It's not like they're trying to screw up, but it happens. It happens sometimes. I have an issue because I only know what has happened to me. I don't know what's happened to anyone else. Maybe others have got bad beats, but I just know in the last few years, the lack of fuel that I have at the end of the race is a lot. It is a lot, and it drives me crazy because it happens so often.
Do you talk to your crew chief and find out like why this is happening, or if it's an issue?
Yeah, I mean, I know, Talladega was the last time that it happened. That wasn't that long ago. We were using the iPad. I was going on the iPad, but if you look, they replayed it on TV. It was like a stutter plug, like in the sense of like tried to hit it, it didn't go in, and then he got it in. So that extra 4/10 of fuel that we didn't get was not enough fuel for me to go hammer down at the last part of the race. Indy, I was in a fantastic shot with Indy. That was a little different, but I had to play fuel saving the whole end of that front. There's just been so many. I need a day or two more to just get over it. But I am super frustrated. But if we want to talk about the pit crew, we can talk about also how they picked me up 7 spots on the first pit stop. I think they picked me up 3 or 4 on the next. Like, I got half. I started 20th. They got me half the spots. I can tell you that.
Yeah. The last question I have when it comes to the fueling thing is just in general, when this does happen, is it because of like a human error, like a tire guy doesn't get the tire tight? Is it a human error, or is it like, we just kind of messed up the strategy here and how much we thought we
Sometimes it
needed?
can be a mix of both. Sometimes you can not get the fuel mileage that you thought you were get. Maybe I'm not doing a good job out on the racetrack of saving fuel as good as others. Everyone has a role in it, right? I certainly have my role as well. But in these types of situations, we decided to, pay our debts later. Having to get that extra, we had to get a splash of that second can. And then, so you're relying on just the timing has to be just absolutely perfect. And, percentage wise, usually it is. But it always seems to be when you're in contention that it just doesn't really pan out like you expected.
Ross Chastain wins the World 600. And if you look at Trackhouse, he's really overachieving when you compare him to his teammates.
Yeah, I mean, new week, same slogan. You always compare yourself versus your teammates, and he is consistently the top guy over there. But we need to give credit to Trackhouse this weekend. We've been pretty hard on them in their lack of speed, lack of everything to start the year, but they absolutely showed up the one was the fastest car in practice by a chunk, not a little bit. And when he wrecked, you look at the left rear tire and they're like,
That's right.
they just were they were being a little aggressive on something, and that's where the speed was coming from. But I think that they proved.
safely. Yep. Yep.
ay may mga panty dyan na hindi na ginagamit at bago pa, pwede natin itong gawing DIY. Pwede natin itong ipagamit sa ating mga anak na babae at makakagawa tayo ng baby bra. O diba guys, ang galing. Kung kayo ay may mga panty dyan na hindi na ginagamit at bago pa, pwede natin itong gawing DIY. Pwede
You still here?
Oh, hey!
Zombie?
With the help, he can make it happen. There we go. Great job. We also have.
Do you know that Lilo is also the girl from The Ring? DeVay Chase provided the voice for Lilo in Lilo and Stitch back in 2002. And the same...
This tiny trick can save your nipples. Some assume its purpose is to hide them from cameras, but that's not entirely true. It's actually used by marathon runners to prevent friction between the shirt and chest. Because over the course of 10 or 20 miles, that friction really adds up, often causing bleeding. That's why some athletes prefer to run shirtless. This tiny trick can...
I'll admit, there were some.
This is why you should never let your emotions control you, because when this guy got dunked on by his opponent, he thought it was a good idea to take out his frustration by throwing the ball in his opponent's face. But just watch how he soon finds out why that was a huge mistake.
You know what, y'all? When I called Angel Reese...
They are about to hit the jackpot with this discovery. Why would someone hide this?
You're back.
Dominic, what's been going on?
So you know the time zone thing and the alleged nuggets, and just
You know what? Don't explain. It's actually okay because Raquel's been keeping me up to date with everything that's been going on in the clubhouse while I've been gone. And some things I found to be very interesting. And I'll address that all, but not before I go to Adam Pearce to get myself a qualifying match for Money in the Bank. Sister, let's go.
you got it. Good luck.
Te dije, vas a verlo.
¿Qué? Chismosa. Isn't it great to have Liv back?
Oh, it sure is.
It's amazing.
You gotta stop trying to eat your nuggets, bro.
Can you see inside?
What?
You can't see it inside?
No. Oh.
You need anything? No? Great.
That was a horrible refill. You only got half the cup. It's still not in the cup. Oh.
You earned a lot of charges this time.
Think you accidentally charged me a pain in the ass?
No, I fully charged that on purpose. Lucky those babysitting fees are free.
Got you a present. I'll be back in 2 hours with your present.
Okay.
You got your surprise.
Why?
Oh my gosh, my son. You love it. That's perfect now. Oh, you're hitting the customers. And go to the bank. Did you like it?
Yes.
Bye, best friend.
Bye.
Have fun
Go.
with your penny.
All right, fine.
You're not catching me now, bitch.